Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Franchise Spotlight. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at 2002's Die Another Day, which was directed by Lee Tamahori. Let's go ahead and get this rolling. So, obviously, this movie is not the best of the franchise. In fact, I think it's actually one of the weaker ones, if not the weakest one. Well, yes, this movie does have a lot of problems with it, and we'll get into that in a second. I do want to talk about the positives first, because I will admit there are a few positives in this movie. The biggest one is all the callbacks to previous James Bond films, whether it is the Q gadgets whenever John Cleese, who now is Q, walks around the Q lab and shows off some gadgets towards Bond. James Bond actually interacts with a jetpack, which was previously used by Sean Connery in Thunderball.
Give me the old firing range any day. Yes, please.
Wow. Wow.
Everything. Does this still work?
And I feel like you wouldn't really know the significance of those without watching the previous Bond films or even like having a general understanding of those gadgets. Naturally, James Bond does have a chase scene in the beginning with hovercrafts, which is actually a pretty well done sequence in my opinion, especially at the end because he does get captured. When typically when you watch an action movie and there's a chase sequence, usually the hero is able to get away or is in safety, but he actually gets captured by the North Koreans in this and is imprisoned for 14 months. And usually if someone were to get captured, they wouldn't be captured for that long. It would have just been like a release, or they would have been able to get out of harm's way anyways to safety. So I really did like it that they just beat down Bond, they tortured him and whatnot. So I thought that that was a very fascinating route that they wanted to go with capturing James Bond. And probably one of the last positives that I have about this film is James Bond actually holds up a book while he's in Havana talking about these studies of birds, the West Indian birds, and the book that he specifically holds up was written by the real James Bond who actually studied birds. I can't remember the scientific word for it, but he was a professional, studied birds, wrote books, and the book he actually holds is written by the real James Bond. So again, it just brings it back to that attention to detail and wanting to give a little bit of fan service. I thought that that was a really, really cool and fascinating way to do it, and you know, me, I appreciated that naturally. So, here are the negatives. A lot of people like to talk about this horrible, horrible surfing scene. Which I agree is not good at all. The green screens and the CG is actually terrible. It's some of the worst I've ever seen. And it's funny because Roger Moore actually ended up watching this movie as well, and he spoke out about his distaste for the movie and how much he didn't like it because they thought they used too much CG, and Roger Moore felt that that wasn't really who James Bond was or the James Bond films, and felt like that they weren't giving off the right tone for Bond, as well as Roger Moore not liking them. Pierce Brosnan did say that Die Another Day was the movie he liked least of all the ones he was in, and I'm not sure if that attributes to it, but it's just probably the weakest Bond film. And like I said, I don't know if it's necessarily the CG that went into it or if he liked the story and didn't like how it turned out. I'm not sure, but he did say that he does not like this movie. This movie definitely has the worst title song, and which is strange because it was performed by Madonna, which you would think would be a little bit better, but when you listen to it, it is just god-awful, and it's too techno-y, and it's too... It doesn't feel as cool or suave as Bond does. Like, usually in previous films, the song kind of captured the feel and the tone for the movie and the James Bond character, but this song is just atrocious and just doesn't fit at all, and I'm not sure why they wanted to go that route with that song, but ultimately they did, and it definitely did not work in their favor. And I know a lot of people have problems with the invisible car, which honestly, when I was watching it, I personally didn't have a big problem with it. Yes, it is a little goofy and ridiculous when you think about it, but I mean, they've had cars that turn into skis, they've had cars that do barrel rolls with Roger Moore. they've had so many car gadgets before that an invisible car doesn't seem like that big of a stretch when you actually think about the past Bond Q gadgets, especially with cars. So the invisible car didn't really bother me as much as it may bother other people, but I can see why that it would bother people. And one of the last things I can say about this film being a huge negative that really stood out to me was the final showdown, if you will, with the villain. He has like a half mecha suit and fights Bond on a plane, which seems a little out there. Seems like they're really going like the superhero route, which is very, very strange, or supervillain route rather. And it doesn't feel authentic. Like, it just feels like it's, you know, obviously it's made up, but like it feels like it's made up in the world. Like, it's such a far stretch of someone having a mecha suit fighting James Bond just to control a satellite to blow up the 38th parallel to start a war. So, I mean, it seems like it's way too far out there for James Bond realism, if you will. And while they're fighting on this plane, it ends up going through a solar flare caused by the satellite, and it just feels like it's taking forever to crash because, you know, it's being ripped apart by the solar flare. And not only that, James Bond shot out a window, which caused a few people to fly out, and the plane is just ripping apart, but it feels like it's in the air forever. And at one point, Halle Berry, who is the Bond girl in this movie, jumps in the cockpit to try to steady it out because it's just taking a straight nosedive to the ground, and she levels it out, but the plane is still thousands of miles off the ground, and it's like, it's crashing and it's not really held together very well, and it just seemed like the plane was in the air forever, and it didn't affect me the way I think the filmmakers intended it to, because it didn't seem like that they were...
Alright, so if you've made it this far, obviously you can tell that I don't have any visuals because my camera actually died, so good for me for charging up my camera before I do a video. But for the sake of finishing out this video, I figured I would just do a voiceover rather than actually setting up my whole, you know, janky little camera setup. My final thoughts are that the plane sequence at the end for the final showdown, I don't think I felt what the filmmakers were intending for the audience to feel, more specifically me in this matter, because the plane was in the air for so long, like I had just stated, and it felt like that there weren't any real stakes, like they were just going to be in the air forever, because you couldn't really tell how fast or how far the plane had fallen and how close it was to the ground, and you really found out how close it was to the ground whenever they finally escape from the plane in a helicopter. And because of that, I just didn't really feel the suspense that I think the filmmakers were intending for us to feel. And again, that's just personally how I feel. However, with the little details that were given in this film that I picked up whenever I was watching it, I did enjoy that, so I'm going to go ahead and give Die Another Day 2 stars. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.